Welcome back. As we saw in the last lecture, the overarching theme for the period of Indian history when the Indus Valley civilization dominated is that we have lots and lots of archaeological evidence in the form of the cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, as well as all the objects found in them. However, we don't have any readable texts from that era to help us interpret the physical evidence. Archaeological evidence can tell us that Indus Valley civilization had pretty much collapsed and those cities had become uninhabited by around 1500 BC. In this lecture, we'll examine the next era of Indian history, the Aryan and Vedic eras, which last from about 1500 BC all the way down to around 500 BC. And for these periods, the situation is somewhat ironically reversed, because what we have surviving is a truly gigantic body of fully readable texts, but we have comparatively little archaeological and material evidence. So whereas the physical evidence surviving from Indus Valley civilization was best at telling us about architecture and certain elements of society, since the texts of the Aryan and Vedic eras are primarily concerned with religious and intellectual ideas, this lecture will accordingly emphasize those aspects of society. The next phase of Indian history starts with migrations that begin around 2000 BC. And there's really several different waves of migrants that emerge out of South Central Asia and move both east and west. One of these groups, who call themselves Aryans, went east through the high mountains of the Hindu Kush and reached India maybe by about 1800 BC. Before I go on, it should be pointed out that when considering the role of the Aryans in early Indian history, you have to separate out misleading concepts derived from the later Nazi misappropriation of the term Aryan to refer to some mythical race. The group that called themselves Aryans were members of a nomadic tribe who spoke an early version of Sanskrit, and that belongs to the Indo-European family of languages. And today, all the Romance languages, the Celtic languages, the Germanic languages, and the Baltic languages all are of Indo-European derivation. And many words in English actually still have direct cognates in Sanskrit. For example, the Sanskrit word nava, which means ship, is clearly related to the English word navy. Deva, meaning God, comes from the same root as the English word divine. Raja, meaning ruler, is related to the English word regal. And finally, the Sanskrit words matru and pitru are recognizably the terms for mother and father. By around 1000 BC, the Aryans had spread down into most of northern India. And remember, the geography of India has always divided up the land into sort of northern and southern zones, with the northern zone centered on the river plains of the north and the southern region being the Deccan Plateau. The Aryan migrations seem to have followed these natural topographical boundaries, since they settled mainly in the more accessible northern part of India. Their language never really takes root in the south, where 4 other non-Indo-European Dravidian languages are still spoken today. Originally, many historians tried to directly link the collapse of Indus Valley civilization to the Aryan migrations. And so they characterized these movements as a sudden and destructive invasion that attacked and destroyed the great Indus Valley cities. And there may be some element of truth in this, we really don't know. But recent work suggests a really more gradual and scattered series of little migrations, in which small new groups came in and intermingled with the old. So that rather seeing this as a sudden apocalyptic invasion, the Aryans just seem to have migrated down into India in little groups over several centuries and gradually intermixed culturally with the indigenous people. The resulting fusion is sometimes called Indo-Aryan culture. And some scholars would even like to push back this Aryan influence into the time of Indus Valley civilization and to ascribe the cultural intermingling to an even earlier phase. There's a lot that remains mysterious about these people, including where exactly they came from. But what is more certain are some of the main characteristics of their culture and the things that they brought in and contributed to later Indian history. And among the most significant of these contributions is that they brought with them, first of all, of course, a new language, Sanskrit. They also brought a new set of gods. They brought a kind of patriarchal and patrilinear focus, which seems to have taken over or superseded the earlier more matriarchal and matrilineal systems. And they brought a new emphasis on a fairly rigid social structure in which people are divided into distinct classes, something I'll come back to later in this lecture. Originally, clearly they were nomads, and even when they settled down, they don't seem to have been inclined to build large cities, but instead lived in small, scattered villages. And despite that kind of glorious architectural heritage of Indus Valley civilization, the Indo-Aryans did not use bricks, and they did not build large permanent structures. Thus, very little archaeological evidence or even material objects such as pottery or weapons remain from the period all the way from 1500 to about 1000 BC. What we do have that tells us about that time is a huge mass of poetry written in Sanskrit and consisting mainly of religious prayers and hymns. There's also several long epic poems which relate the deeds of gods and heroes. Now, the Aryans themselves seem to have been illiterate, but they clearly had a very vibrant culture of oral poetry. These verses would be transmitted orally from one generation down to another. And many, many centuries later, some of them finally get written down. The very earliest of these written versions of these oral poems are called the Vedas, and they're thought to have been composed somewhere between 1500 and 600 BC, although the surviving versions that we have were probably not recorded in written form until even a little bit later than that. The oldest, most important Veda, whose original date of composition is estimated to have been before 1100 BC, is the Rig Veda. Literally, it means the verses of knowledge. And it consists of 1,017 Sanskrit poems, most of which are addressed to their gods. To this would eventually be added 3 later Vedas: the great epic poems, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana, and further groups of religious texts which are called the Upanishads and the Puranas. Collectively, all of these form a huge sort of unruly body of diverse texts, literally hundreds of thousands of verses long and millions of words. And while the primary focus of these texts is on religion, they represent a kind of conglomeration or mishmash of different time periods, both in terms of their original composition and when they were later written down. But these texts offer clues about what early Aryan culture was like and that later Indo-Aryan fusion. The Aryans were organized into tribal, kin-centered groups, which quite often just consisted of a local small king, or really we might call him a warlord, and his immediate group of retainers. Originally, these groups were fully nomadic, and their economic life was centered around herding cattle. And even when later they began to settle down, they still lived in small villages and preserved a lot of elements of their earlier nomadic lifestyle, So they would combine together some hunting, some herding, some raiding, and maybe a little bit of farming and agriculture. One surviving Veda offers a typically mixed set of professions that are found in a single family. In it, the protagonist says, "I am a bard, my father is a healer, and my mother grinds corn. Diverse in profession, we all desire wealth, and to acquire cattle, we all strive together." In later Vedic society, we see much more specialization of different professions. So in just a short passage from one hymn, we find the following list of jobs, many of which are really surprisingly narrow. We have bow maker, rope maker, bowstring maker, arrow maker, hide dresser, female cane splitter, female thorn worker, female ointment maker, female sheath maker, stone breaker, horse keeper, wood carrier, fire kindler, cowherd, hunter, fisherman, smith, goldsmith, merchant, physician, and astrologer. Despite the occasional appearance of women in professions, the vast majority of women were mostly involved in textile work, such as spinning, weaving, embroidering, and dyeing. The Aryans were clearly a warlike culture, and they enjoyed an edge in battle due to, once again, their mastery of horses and chariots. Unlike some ancient warriors, they had developed spoked wheels for their chariots rather than solid wheels, and this gave them a distinct advantage in speed and maneuverability on the battlefield. These chariots would be drawn by one or sometimes two horses, and they would typically carry a driver and then an archer or a spear thrower. In addition, the Aryans employed bronze axes and swords. In the Vedas and the epics, the horse-drawn chariot is portrayed as the vehicle of the gods, which we can interpret as a reflection of the high status of the human warriors who were able to afford this really very expensive piece of military equipment and the horses that go with it. The epics contain detailed and very, very lengthy accounts of battles, and plainly one's status in this society was dependent on your military skill. The gods encourage displays of bravery and skill on the battlefield, as in a very famous passage of the Bhagavad Gita, where the god Krishna instructs one warrior, and Krishna tells him, "Fall not into degrading weakness, for this becomes not one who wishes to be a man." Also, very typical of these poems is a constant concern with spirituality. And even here, it's clear that a warrior's fight should have a spiritual dimension in which he's obligated to do his duty and to follow the will of the gods. The general impression that we get of this culture is that it's a warlike, hard-living, male-dominated culture. We have heroes who like to drink wine and eat a lot of beef. They fight, they race chariots, they enjoy music, singing, dancing, and not least of all, gambling. Cheating at dice seems to be a recurrent problem, at least judging from the many mentions of it in the Rig Veda. In one section, which is called the Gambler's Song, we have a gambler who vividly laments the negative effects of his addiction to gambling. He says, "Without any fault of hers, I have driven my devoted wife away because of a lost bet. My mother-in-law hates me. My wife pushes me away. In defeat, the gambler finds no one to pity him. He is like an aged horse, put up for sale. When I stop playing, all my so-called friends depart and leave me lonely." At the time of the Indus Valley civilizations, the Ganges Valley was heavily forested and not very populated. But by around 500 BC, the Ganges River Valley had developed into a very densely populous region studded with villages. Lots of little states emerge, and these states begin to be rivals with one another and to come into conflict. We really know very little about specific political developments and actual historical events during the Vedic period. So for almost 1,000 years, from about 1500 BC down to around 500 BC, this is an extraordinarily rich time in terms of intellectual, social, and religious history. We know absolutely nothing about political history. Once again, this is a reflection of the surviving sources. The Vedas and the epics tend to focus either on religious and philosophical issues or on colorful stories about the exploits of semi-mythical heroes, gods, and demons. But it's informative to consider what people of the Vedic period chose to leave out, as well as what they chose to record. And maybe the transitory nature of little kingdoms that fought, rose, and fell rendered them insignificant and were regarded as not worth remembering to a culture that was obsessed with the great mysteries of the universe and these cycles through which both humans and individual souls were moving. So a religion that espoused the importance of Rita, meaning that the universal order of all things, simply might not have found all the disorderly conflicts of little chieftains to be that compelling or worth recording. Vedic culture did achieve some important innovations in practical fields as well as metaphysical ones. The so-called Arabic number system actually originated in India, as did Damascus steel, which was then introduced much, much later to Europe by the Arabs. Indian medicine, or Ayurveda, derived from the words Ayur meaning longevity and Veda meaning knowledge, developed into a sophisticated system that may have influenced, and maybe was influenced by, Chinese and Greek medical thinkers. One important institution whose development at least began during this era is the caste system of India, in which people are born into a specific social class from which they cannot change. And this term caste system is actually a Western one. And exactly when the final version of the social structure emerged is something that's uncertain. But it seems to have developed and solidified gradually over time. And it seems to have incorporated aspects from several existing social institutions. One thing that certainly played into the caste system came from the Aryans' division of people into four basic categories called varnas. At the top were the Brahmins, which was composed of philosophers, scholars, and most importantly, priests. Next came the warrior class, which also included politicians, soldiers, and civil authorities. Then the third class was merchants, peasants, and farmers. And finally, the fourth was the Shudras, the common workers and servants. I suppose the very lowest stratum of Hindu society was the untouchables and the pariahs. They were the outcasts who literally were so low they stood outside the caste system. The idea of ritual pollution, which plays a key role in later Indian history, is already clearly present in Vedic culture if we look at the way that the Shudras are treated. No contact was allowed with Shudras or their food. Shudras could not perform sacrifice, and a holy man or teacher wasn't even supposed to look at one. The Vedas were considered to be so pure that they could not be heard or recited by a Shudra. And according to legal texts, if a Shudra was caught secretly listening to the Vedas, he then should have molten lead poured into his ears. Even more impure were the persons belonging to the untouchables. They had to live outside villages and towns, wear old garments, and have special marks for identification. And they could have no social intercourse with their betters at all. The top three classes were called the twice-born, whereas the Shudras were regarded as once-born. And what this has to do with is twice-born refers to a ceremony that would be held at puberty in which boys were initiated into adulthood. And after going through the ceremony, male members of the top 3 castes could demonstrate their status by wearing a special sacred thread over the left shoulder. This was almost like a sash, and they would wear that for the rest of their lives. The Rig Veda offers a memorable explanation of how these 4 Varnas were originally created. In the story, each class emerged from a different part of the original cosmic man's body. The Brahmins issued forth first from the mouth. The warriors came second from the arms. The merchants and farmers third from the thighs. And last of all, the Shudras came forth from the feet. This nicely summarizes their symbolic roles and status in society. The caste system provided a certain stability to Indian society, and it also gave individuals a clearly established role to play. And while we look at this and say that the discrimination practiced against the lower classes may seem harsh, the reality is that the system also acted as a kind of support or welfare structure, since all the members of one class or kin group were obligated to look after one another and to assist any who met with misfortune. Out of this era and these contexts developed the religion that today we call Hinduism. And Hinduism is difficult to summarize because it's a complex religion that includes a very wide range of practices, customs, and rituals and beliefs that sometimes are different from one another. Hinduism does not have a single founder figure or even a single sacred text, nor is it tied to any specific place or group. But at its core are that great assemblage of holy texts such as the Vedas and the epics. And of these, especially important for early Hinduism is the Rig Veda, which was a guidebook to proper ritual, prayer, and behavior. Another particularly influential text is the Bhagavad Gita, which is a section of the larger Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita is sometimes referred to as Hinduism's main ethical text because it offers a fairly straightforward description of the duties and obligations of humans with respect to the gods. And it describes the nature of the eternal soul, which can live on through various incarnations. The Bhagavad Gita takes place during a sort of mythical great war fought between 2 sets of cousins. One of the heroes involved in this is named Prince Arjuna, and he's preparing to fight, but at the same time he's deeply troubled at the prospect of potentially having to kill his own friends, relatives, and teachers. His charioteer, who in reality is the god Krishna in disguise, then delivers a rather long explanation of why it's okay to kill them. And he says this is because bodily death does not kill the eternal soul, which will be reborn over and over again. And it's essential that one obey one's obligations and act in accordance with one's duty, which in turn is determined by things like your caste and your family. Now, when acting, however, it's essential that you do so selflessly, without influence from a desire or ambition. Each person has a prescribed duty and a role in society. And moral behavior is dependent on trying to adhere as closely as possible to your role or your duty. Some of these key concepts outlined by Krishna include the idea of dharma, which we might crudely define as the selfless execution of your earthly duties. Arjuna, in this instance, must fight because he is a ruler, and it is his dharma to uphold righteous authority. Not just human beings, but the gods have their own individual duties, which they have to perform correctly in order to keep the universe in balance and running smoothly, in accordance with Rita, cosmic order. That balance is a delicate one, which is constantly being threatened by these demons of falsehood and by our own sins and negative behavior. Closely tied up with dharma is the idea of karma. And karma is the consequences of your own actions. So following your dharma will lead to a good karma. Dharma and karma are fundamental concepts in Hinduism, as are a whole range of other practices such as meditation, asceticism, and tolerance. Furthermore, because of the belief that divine truth is a universal, it follows that all faiths lead to the same goal. And so you can reach truth through varied paths, just as every individual has his or her own dharma. The Hindu doctrine of transmigration of souls is another key belief, and it says that after death, all living things will be reborn into a new body. And the status of this new form is determined based on your behavior and deeds in your previous existence. Or in other words, by the kind of collective karma that your earlier incarnation had established. You can see this theory of transmigration of souls as one natural response to the caste system, in which you're locked into a certain place by birth. Your position in the hereditary caste order is explained and implicitly should be accepted as a result of your own actions, merits, or faults in a previous life. On the other hand, by following your dharma and accumulating good karma, you can hope that you can better your lot in the next life, and thus it makes whatever misfortunes occur in this life a little bit more acceptable. Many components, especially those concerning transmigration, karma, and dharma, are ones that get added on more towards the end of the Vedic period. And while these sorts of spiritual aspects become more and more important over time, earlier beliefs had laid a greater emphasis on religious rituals, especially prayer, meditation, and most of all, sacrifice. Aryan religion focused on making sacrificial offerings to the gods. And these would be things such as grain, clarified butter, which is called ghee, or animals. Goats, bulls, cows, sheep, horses, they were all slaughtered as offerings to the gods. And bits of meat were placed on a sacred fire built upon altars. As time went on, the priestly class of the Brahmins came to dominate religious observances, and particularly the performance of sacrifice. And more emphasis was placed on following the correct ritual or the procedure, which only the Brahmins really knew. Texts which were called the Brahmanas, literally the things said by a Brahmin, became attached to the Vedas, and these began to outline more and more complicated ritual formulas. Questions about things like spirituality or morality was neglected in favor of lists of how to perform specific rituals. And these elaborate sacrificial rites meant that only the Brahmins could perform them. So they had a stranglehold on religious affairs. And of course, this further elevated their status in society. As you might imagine, all of this eventually led to resentment, and ultimately to people questioning and criticizing the path that religion had taken. In the next couple centuries, there would be a reaction against this perhaps excessive ritualization of worship. And the result will be the emergence of a number of variants of Hinduism, as well as several completely new and influential religions such as Buddhism and Jainism. Our survey of early Indian civilization has now brought us up to about 500 BC. And next, we're going to return to the Mediterranean world, where we'll encounter some early Greek cultures that, interestingly enough, in many ways, have a lot in common with Vedic India. Thank you.